Welcome to Channel World Story 22, a channel that always presents news about the history of countries around the world. On this good occasion, Channel World Story 22 will discuss the occurrence of the Gulf War. This war involved many countries such as America, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, England, France and others. Then what caused this Gulf War? Before continuing to the discussion, I will remind you first for those of you who haven't subscribed to this channel. Please subscribe to this channel first, so you don't miss historical news from around the world. On August 2, 1990, Iraq invaded Kuwait, its tiny oil-rich neighbor, and within hours had occupied the country's most strategic position. 1 week later, Operation Desert Shield, America's defense of Saudi Arabia, began as U.S. troops congregated in the Persian Gulf. 3 months later, the United Nations Security Council, UNSC, passed a resolution authorizing the use of force against Iraq if it failed to withdraw from Kuwait on the 15th of January 1991. At 4:30 p.m. EST on January 16, 1991, Operation Desert Storm, the massive US-led offensive against Iraq, began. The first warplanes were launched from Saudi Arabia and took off from US and British aircraft carriers in the Persian Gulf. Throughout the night, planes from the US-led military coalition pounded targets in and around Baghdad as the world watched on television footage broadcast live via satellite from Baghdad and elsewhere. Operation Desert Storm was conducted by an international coalition under the command of US General Norman Schwarzkopf and featured troops from 32 countries, including the UK, Egypt, France, Saudi Arabia and Kuwait. Over the next 6 weeks, Allied forces engaged in a major air war against Iraq's military and civilian infrastructure, encountering little effective resistance from the Iraqi Air Force. Iraqi ground troops were also helpless during this stage of the war. And the only significant act of retaliation by Iraqi leader Saddam Hussein was the launch of Scud missile attacks against Israel and Saudi Arabia. Saddam hoped that the missile attack would provoke Israel, so that later other Arab countries would also be involved in the conflict. But at the request of the US, Israel stayed out of the war. On February 24, 1991, the massive coalition ground offensive began. Iraq's outdated and undersupplied armed forces were quickly overwhelmed. By the end of the day, the Iraqi army had been effectively defeated. Its 10,000 troops are being held as prisoners, and a US air base has been set up deep in Iraq. After less than 4 days, Kuwait was liberated, and the majority of the Iraqi armed forces had either been destroyed or had surrendered and withdrew. On February 28, US President George Bush declared a ceasefire, and Iraq pledged to respect future coalition and UN peace terms. 125 US troops died in the Persian Gulf War, and 21 others are considered missing in action.